Hello out there, and welcome to our second power panel of 2023. Tonight's event is called East Coast Style. It features some of the most talented and exciting writers from Canada's Atlantic coast and will focus on their unique perspectives in storytelling. My name is Alana Rabinovich, and I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's conversation. The host tonight is none other than Tom Power, the powerhouse behind CBC Radio Q, or Tom J. Power on TikTok. Thank you, Tom, for agreeing to moderate the panel. Our guests tonight are an impressive and award-winning lot, beginning with photographer, spoken word artist, and writer Amanda Carvery. Megan Gail Coles, upcoming producer and a writer of plays, screenplays, poetry, and prose. Mark Critch, writer, producer, and performer. Michael Crummey, author of 12 books of fiction and poetry. And Fenton, author, spoken word artist, screenwriter, and arts educator. Audience, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen during the last 15 minutes. We'll take questions. Tom will take questions and put them to the panel on your behalf. So I want to get to it as much as you do without any further delay. Here's Tom and the rest of the panelists.
Well, what a joy it is. Thank you so much, Alana, for asking me to be a part of this. And I think I can speak on behalf of everybody here that it's such a joy to be a part of this. In particular for me, because I'm in Toronto right now. I'm in the studio that I work at here at CBC. I am unbelievably homesick all the time. Like, everyone I know is going to Mexico and to Florida and to go get out of the heat. All I'm trying to do is go back to Newfoundland to get more gray weather and more fog and more snow. And this panel already, the chat we were having before, is making me incredibly homesick. If you don't know, I'm from St. John's in Newfoundland and Labrador. You wouldn't know because I never talk about it. It never really comes up in any of my work, and I usually try to keep it a bit of a secret, but I am. And when I got on the line, and I just checked in with everybody, I had never met Andre or Amanda before. I said, hi, how you doing? I just checked in and said hello. And I said, Amanda, how do you, I'm going to make sure I get your name right. And Amanda, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but she said, oh yeah, Carvery. And I was like, oh my God, I'm home. The amount of Ontarians I have to deal with saying like, yeah, Carvery, that drove me crazy. So as soon as I heard you say your name, Amanda, I was absolutely delighted, and I felt transported back to the ship in St. John's. It's a great joy to be here. So one of the things we're going to do off the top is we're going to talk a little bit about where each of these tremendous East Coast authors are from, the environments that they grew up in, and how that may or may not have led to their chosen profession or their chosen, I guess, vocation when it comes to writing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about their careers, but I want to keep the eyes open at the Q&A thing at the bottom. If you click on that and put in some questions, when we get to around, I'd say about 35 minutes from now, I'm going to dig into the tickle trunk and get a few questions out and ask them to the panelists. So keep your eyes out for that. It's a great joy to be here. I like any opportunity I can to talk about the East Coast of Canada, and I like any opportunity I get to talk to these people especially. So I thought what we could do is we could start with Megan Gail Coles, because I know you and I know I can start with you. So I was wondering if you could start by telling us a little bit about where you're from on the Great Northern Peninsula, and a little bit about what it was like to grow up there and what your experience was growing up there. And then maybe we can talk a little bit more about what that might have led to.
So I'm from a small fishing community in the Strait of Belle Isle area on the Great Northern Peninsula of the island. And the Strait of Belle Isle area is especially well known for the fact that it's the closest point to the continent of North America from the island of Newfoundland. So they're constantly considering digging a tunnel to Labrador from my very hometown. Now this tunnel has never actually occurred. There is a big hole in the ground.
Is there really?
Yes, we used to drink in it as teenagers. Please don't judge me for that. But they've started. And so in some ways, where I'm from has always had a lot of like grand aspirations that were ultimately unfulfilled. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it led to me wanting to be a storyteller, but it does kind of foster this level of flexibility or adaptability. Like we're very resourceful, or we have a strong sense of like understanding that we have to entertain ourselves. It's also one of the windiest places on the island. Like the west coast of Newfoundland is quite windy anyway. It's well known for the gale force winds, but the Strait of Belle Isle being where the Labrador Current comes down from the northern part of the world also brings with it like much terrible weather. So you have to have a quick voice and a strong kind of insistence on communication sometimes when you're outside of the house and trying to be understood. I think all of this kind of informs our storytelling, and it makes us, or it made me and my family, I can only speak to our experience, really kind of playful with our language, and sometimes a bit biting with our sense of humor, because man, when you're getting smacked in the face with like freezing rain,
Yeah.
it kind of informs your personality a little bit.
Would there be books around? I mean, would there be like a literary sensibility around you?
No, there's no literary sensibility. Or I mean, there wasn't a literary sensibility necessarily when I was growing up. Traditionally, the area had a very like kind of little access to that kind of thing. Because I mean, when you think about it, we didn't have a road until not so many years ago, and there weren't just there were no such thing as bookstores or
Libraries.
libraries.
Yeah.
There is a library in St. And there is a library in Bourgeois. I feel like I always have to like acknowledge the places that do have things, because if anyone's listening to be like, now that's not true, Maggie, there was definitely a library in Snanny, but Snanny's an hour and a half away from me. And when you're a child, you can't hardly get across the road, let alone down to Snanny, they take a book out of the library, right?
Right.
And so we very much depended on our school library, which was a kind of oasis for me as a child. I think a lot of writers had a similar experience when they first encountered a proper library. And unfortunately, that doesn't exist in my area anymore. They've kind of taken the books out of the library and made it into a different kind of educational facility. But I always feel saddened by that, because I wonder if who I am is even possible now, given the depletion of like some of the arts and cultural resources in some of our northern communities or our rural remote communities. I'm not just speaking directly to Newfoundland and Labrador, I'm speaking all across the country that we call Canada. We don't seem to have as much focus or value placed on arts and culture and sports and things like this. And so I feel like I benefited from the fact that there were still these things in the classroom at that time. There were still books in the classroom. There were still paints and sandboxes and all of that thing, all those things. We had a parachute and whatnot.
Oh my, pretty good. Parachute.
Yeah. But we were more an oral storytelling tradition than a literary tradition in the traditional sense of speaking.
I mean, there's something to be said for that, about the idea that these things were accessible to you at the time, and now when you're able to go home, these things are not as accessible to the people that live there. And that's a trend we're seeing. I certainly have seen it on kind of my travels all across Canada. And I'm interested to see how that kind of transcends throughout generations and in through communities that we have on the panel here today. Michael, Buckins, right? Buckins in the central part of Newfoundland and Labrador.
Yeah, one of the only communities in there. Yeah, it was a mining town, so that's the only reason it was there. And it was a kind of an outlier in Newfoundland, of course, because people in Buckins were from all over, right? There were people from all over the island in Buckins who would come there for work. And it's nowhere near salt water. But I always say that like everybody around me was from an outport. Like all of my friends' parents were from outports. So I feel like I was raised by the outport, even though I didn't grow up anywhere near the ocean. And I think that had a huge impact on me as just in terms of how I thought of storytelling and what I thought it was for, you know. Like I've always said that I'm at best, I'm the second best storyteller in my family. I'm probably third or fourth. if I want to be really honest about it. But my father was somebody who, he grew up in an outport, started fishing when he was 9 years old, quit school at 16, was not a reader, but he was a storyteller, and he had a repertoire of stories, right? You could request particular stories from Dad, and they weren't told word for word each time, but he had figured out how that story worked. He had a great sense of narrative, wicked sense of timing, very funny. And I mean, I think I traveled a road through, like I went to university and all that sort of stuff, and fell in love with poetry and all those sorts of things that made me want to be a writer. But when I sat down to write, part of what came out was my father's voice. Part of what I was trying to get on paper was his way of telling stories. And I think that's still there, you know, like I've been at this a long time now, and I feel like I've morphed a lot over the years. But I feel like that beginning point, that sitting in a room and hearing people telling stories about their own lives, is still pretty central to my sense of what storytelling is all about.
What did they make of it when you started writing books when you went back home?
Well, I mean, it's a weird thing, I think, well, you know, I write a lot about my family, you know, like I was telling stories about my own life and about my parents and their lives. And luckily there were no deep, dark secrets, right? So it wasn't like I wasn't in danger of being.
Sure, Michael.
Yeah.
Come on now.
But I think it is a mixed blessing. Even situations where there aren't deep, dark secrets, it's a mixed blessing having a writer in your life, you know. And my dad apparently did say to my mother at one point, "Well, you got to watch what you say to him."
Yeah.
Because you just don't know, right, where this might end up.
Yeah.
So they were incredibly supportive, but they didn't really know what to make of it. And Dad especially, I think, partly because of the financial side of it, was he just did not understand it. I remember when I was almost 30 when I finally got a contract to write a book, and I've been writing as a vocation since I was 17. And I remember when I told him, you know, I'm going to have a book of poetry published. He said, "Oh, that's great. You know, it's really good news." And then his first question was, "Well, what are they paying you?" And I said, you know, $750. And the look on his face when I told him that, like, he was just stunned, you know, because I had spent most of my adult life working to that moment. And I was clearly happy as a pig in shit.
Yeah.
Have a book coming out.
Yeah. And
all he could think was, I mean, that's 1 month's rent. Yeah. Yeah. So I think it took a long time for him to stop worrying about me. Yeah. Yeah. It's such a different way of making a living. It's such a different way of thinking even about a living. I got to talk to Lindsay Wong there the other day, who wrote the woo-woo about her family on Canada Reads a few years ago. And she told me that it was about her memoir about her family. And she said that now she had to move back in with them during COVID. And when she would walk into the room, everyone would be quiet. Because no one wanted to say anything, because it might not end up in another book. Amanda, I'm going to go to you here, because I think we can expand on the theme of family and representation of our family and telling the stories of our family. So if you could, I'd love for you to talk about being from Halifax for sure, but also a little bit about where your family is from in Halifax.
Yeah. So yes, I'm from Halifax, and my father is from the community of Africville, which was demolished in the 60s there. But we still have a very, very strong community. We still get together frequently and celebrate things together. It's a very tight-knit community, and it's just a different experience to get to write with my elders from that community. You know, I listen to their stories and kind of make it into a fluid story kind of thing. And they're just, it's really great and interesting, and lots of stuff that is secrets, and they're like, so this doesn't get in there, okay, so none of that, you know, but I have to tell you, right? So it's really such an honor to sit down with everyone and like get to hear these things firsthand. I'm definitely someone who has focused on like storytelling orally, just with my performing of poetry and spoken word. It's just kind of something I fell into and always had a passion for. So it fits very well with my passions there.
What talk to me a little bit about like why you felt some compulsion or some desire to want to write some of these stories down, to want to capture some of these stories in a way that would that would last.
So the reason I wanted to capture it is because when people talk about my dad's community of Africville, they talk about what surrounded the community and not what was actually in the community or about the people in the community. So, you know, they always talk about how there was a city dump and there was an infectious diseases hospital and a prison, but those weren't the actual community. And so it really like was a struggle for me growing up because I felt such joy and happiness there. But when we talk about the community, we talk about it in a very sad, ugly way that just it didn't fit with me. So I was like, I want to hear these stories about the joyful memories. I want everybody to talk about the happiness that they had, and I want people from outside that community to see that, you know, our community is more than just the bad things that have happened there. It's actually so much love and so much joy and happiness. You know?
The focus on trauma and the focus on sadness in itself can be dehumanizing. In itself can rob a community of a narrative of which has already been robbed so much. Were you surrounded by, like, were you in the literary world? Like, I just heard Megan and Michael talk a little bit about this. Like, were you surrounded by books? Was being in the literary world something you were looking for?
I've always been surrounded by books, always growing up. Yeah, I was very much that kid that just stayed inside. I read books with my mother, like together, until I was like 16. Like we'd still get together and read books together. So yeah, I've always written, and I've always I kind of stuck more to poetry, but I feel like that fits with how I write now. So
Well, it's a beautiful thing. Andre, I find the story here interesting because in order to talk about your sort of journey towards, if I'm not mistaken, in order to talk about your journey towards the written word, we kind of have to start by talking about the spoken word. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about where you grew up and maybe what led you to spoken word, because I think that was the first thing you did, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Growing up, I grew up in the north end of Halifax. I was always that journal kid that would write so many outrageous stories about things that would happen in my neighborhood. And I knew I always wanted to be a writer since I was a kid. Some of my old classmates will message me on Facebook and say, hey, I remember when we were in elementary school, you said that you were going to write books someday. And I find that really funny. But yeah, I knew going into high school, I really wanted to continue writing stories, but it wasn't until I got to grade 12, I took African Canadian literature. And when we got to our poetry unit in that class, we didn't read poetry from books, but my teacher brought in a TV and a DVD player. We watched the first few seasons of Def Jam poetry, which was so cool. And just the way these poets were speaking, telling these stories, and this really cool way spoke to me, especially me being the shyest kid in the room, like, yo, I gotta try this. So I guess my journey is I started hanging out at this hip hop studio with a bunch of rappers that were all way cooler than me until one day the former poet laureate Al Jones came to the studio and was telling me about a poetry slam that was happening across the bridge in Dartmouth. I had no idea what a poetry slam was. I just had a poem. I didn't know it was a competition or what was going to happen. I got up on stage, performed my poem, notebook in front of my face, too afraid to make eye contact. And it really wasn't so bad. I came third place at my first ever slam, but one thing I didn't know was that it was finals night for the Halifax Poetry Slam. That meant the top 5 poets that placed were going to represent Halifax at nationals in Montreal. So I kind of just fell into this really cool thing. And I think for me, falling into poetry was one of the best mistakes I've ever made. And because it was just totally random, but I feel like the art of spoken word really taught me what empathy was, because I was just some 18-year-old kid at the time, and just being able to travel, going all these places and just hearing people tell their stories from so many different walks of life really instilled empathy in me in the time when I really needed it. And I always stress to the students that I work with that regardless of where you go in your writing career, having a foundation of poetry can make things so much easier sometimes, because there's an intimidation factor with poetry. And I feel like once you realize that it's such a way to build confidence, it's such a way to be able to tell your story, but also improves your narrative in a lot of different ways. That's such a versatile tool to have. And I was lucky enough to be brought into this community. I met Amanda at one of the slams a long time ago, and you know, I was just really lucky to be able to fall into this really wonderful community that took me in with open arms.
Amanda, what do you remember about young Andre, meeting young Andre?
I was going to say, I remember you coming to our shows and getting up there, and he was so nervous, and we were like, no, you have such powerful words, you need to get up there, don't be shy. So yeah, it's so wonderful to see him doing so well right now. Yeah.
Is that community still going? Is the spoken word community still going in Halifax?
It comes and goes.
Yeah,
it comes and goes.
when the first time, let's talk about that. The first time you get up on stage and you're going to deliver your poetry, two things, like what emotions were you feeling? Like what was going through your mind? And what was the first piece about?
Oh, getting up on stage the first time was so anxiety driven. I'd never done anything like that before. And I feel like the first poem I had, I believe it was a poem I wrote called Invisible Walls, which is a poem that was about bullying, mental health, and just a lot of stuff that I was struggling with at the time in high school. It was very angsty, and I actually don't have a copy of the poem anymore. But it was just a poem that was wearing my heart on my sleeves, telling my story. And I guess it just resonated with a lot of folks. And you know, I was so nervous to put myself out there, but you know, it was a really kind, warm crowd that just took me as I am.
I won't ask you if you remember any of it. I won't ask you to recite it. I won't, I promise. Like I know, I can tell that's not the move, but it's a pretty amazing story. Now, let's get to Mark here now. And Mark, I think it's an interesting path to writing to you, because ostensibly we are here to talk to you about your books, right? The Embarrassment of Critches and Son of a Critch. Well, what people might not know who are watching this is that the writing part of your career started much earlier. You told me a story one time about, I think you were in high school and you used to skip off class because you had a sketch comedy group that would do sort of like Codco-esque satirical sketches. So talk to me a little bit about the St. John's, my hometown also, the St. John's that you grew up in, and a little bit about how that might have informed some of that early writing you did.
Well, as everyone knows, I don't like talking about growing up, but I'll make an exception. Yeah, so I grew up on the outskirts of St. John's next to VOCM, the radio station where my dad worked. And nobody in my family talked about the past, because mom and dad, their lives, as I found out much, were not great growing up. A lot of poverty, and dad's actual father died of TB when he was 5, and mom's mother kind of left, and it was all, so they never talked about anything. It was all kind of reinvention after a certain point. There was no past, there was only the present. And dad was a news reporter. And so we lived next to VOCM, where all these jocks, and like Rex Murphy worked there then. And it was like this bizarre world of talkers and liars to a degree. Like that, to be interesting in Newfoundland on the radio was very tough. It's hard enough to be interesting in a bar, but to be interesting on the radio, there's a lot of stuff you had to say. So dad, people would tell me, like there was one time, dad, we lived like by the woods too, right? Kemont Road was going through the woods. And so these two moose were fighting over a lady moose, a meese, I'm not sure, I'm not good with words. And so she was there. And so traffic on Kemont Road stopped because their antlers or horns or whatever, they're banging against it. They're the big old fight. And so dad reported it by saying, the two amorous moose, or their antlers locked, fought valiantly for the admiration of the female moose, who looked at her suitors with disdain, and did this whole big soap opera about this happening. And that was just, it wasn't, but there was always like this big situation made of everything. And so these people would be at the house and they were great talkers. And, you know, one of my earliest memories was Rex Murphy passed out on my couch after a night of the two of them reading poetry to each other and stuff on the booze, you know. And so there was all these, it was a very interesting place. And then dinners, people argued about politics. Mom was hilarious. So everybody was always making fun of current events. And it was an interesting place to be. A lot of humor, a lot of wit, a lot of dark humor. And then, so anyway, when I was watching TV, there was a great show called Wonderful Grand Band, which had Greg Malone and Tommy Sexton. And these were my great heroes growing up. These were Newfoundlanders writing their own work and performing it. And since then, that's the only thing I wanted to really do. Like, I never wanted to grow up. I wanted to be an entertainer. I didn't want to be on an American sitcom or something. I wanted to write my own stuff, kind of tell Newfoundland stories to a degree, and perform them myself. So when I was 15, I met up with this other guy, Steve McGraw, in the drama festival, and we're like, well, we should do a sketch comedy show. And we went down, we rented the LSPU Hall with Longshoremen's Protective Union, which is a small theater in St. John's. And they let 15-year-old kids rent a building. And, you shouldn't do that, right? And it was 11 o'clock slot. And we got down, there was a 60-40 split on the door. And we go down there and we wrote and perform our own stuff. And we're going down there performing to a mix of some people in the arts community, a couple of friends, and some kind of sailors who came off a boat expecting a different kind of cabaret. And so we were doing this show and it was great. And I was wearing my dad's red jacket that I wear on the show now, did an impression of my dad and got a big laugh. And then we had all these different skits in a Codco-esque style. Young Rick Mercer was there. Rick was about 4 or 5 years older than me and always felt like he was in grade 12 and I was in grade 9, So he was like the cool kid, like Fonzie talking to Chachi saying, good job. And
I still feel that way. I still feel that way about it.
Yeah, right. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
So we, and that was it. And so since then, I think in the arts that I grew up in, everybody wrote and produced their own work. So if you wanted to do this, that's how you did it. Like, it wasn't even thinking like, well, we should find this play and we should really rehearse it. It's like, oh, I guess we got to write something. So you're always bringing your own words to the table and performing them. And that to me has always been the most interesting and exciting thing.
It's a pretty amazing story, and I think like we've already like taken up a lot of time just telling our stories, but this is really compelling to me to figure out sort of the disparate and very similar experiences that each of us may come from. So I spent a lot of time in my own job being asked the question, and I'm sure you guys have all been asked it too, like, what is it in the water out there? You guys are so much incredible talent there out in the East Coast, and I find myself sometimes kind of pushing back on it and going like, well, there's an incredible amount of talent everywhere in Canada, and like, well, there's something about out there in the East Coast. It's so incredible talent out there, and I want to go, well, yeah, there's an incredible amount of talent. People are actually very nice in a lot of different places, and but the more we're talking here, and the more I've had a chance to reflect, I figured if we're ever going to talk about it, and this might be the place and time to do it, about whether we as authors, and I'm not an author, but whether ye as authors feel part of an East Coast like oeuvre or part of an East Coast thing, or if you could talk a little bit about perhaps the circumstances or is something ephemeral that might lead to there being an East Coastiness to your work or to the work that comes out of it. And I can tell everyone's very nervous about being the first to ask, so I'm going to have to ask somebody. And Michael, I think I might go to you because I feel like you have maybe been asked this the most than any other writer. Have you gotten any thoughts on this over the years?
Yeah, I mean, from the time I started publishing, I've been and doing festivals and stuff like that. I've been put on panels with other Newfoundland writers, in which we're asked to explain what the hell is going on, right?
Yeah, I know.
Why are there so many writers out of Newfoundland, and why is the rest of Canada and to a certain extent the rest of the world so interested in stories from this place? And I don't have a really good answer for it. I mean, part of it is just the interest is partly just the faddishness of the publishing business, like we're not very far away from a time when a Newfoundland author couldn't get published with a major house in Canada, right? Because the received wisdom was that no one outside of Newfoundland would be interested in a story about Newfoundland. When Bernice Morgan was shopping around her great book, Random Passage. Her agent said, "It's a great book. I don't think I can find you a publisher outside of Newfoundland." And he was right. And then the shipping news happened, right? And then the Colony of Unrequited Dreams followed right on its heels. And then all of a sudden, mainland publishers were down here beating the bushes, like looking for the next Newfoundland writer. And luckily, there were tons of us here, you know? And so part of it is just that. It's like there were a lot of us here working really hard at a time when finally they started looking in this direction. But there is something more to it as well. I remember having a conversation with a writer from Ontario who had come to see a panel, a Newfoundland writer panel, and she could not understand what. She's like, they don't have a Nova Scotia writer panel or an Ontario writer panel. Like, what is it? And I was trying to answer her as she was getting off the elevator, and I was saying, "Oh, you know, it's something about we have a shared cultural history and a shared past and a blah blah blah." And she said, "Oh, you're an ethnic group." And to a certain extent, I think that's true. Like that, there's a shared sense of history and a shared culture here that exists only here, and that creates a particular way of being in the world that is unlike how people are elsewhere, and that's interesting to people elsewhere. I think, you know, the same way that I'm interested in stories from Australia or Jamaica or some other part of the world that I don't know. Part of what I love about those stories is what's different about them, what it tells me about how people live elsewhere, how different conditions create different kinds of cultures. So I think I feel like I'm going on.
No, I mean, yeah.
I do think there's something to that, but I am worried. I know that there's a sense of fatigue that sets in with some of my friends, you know, like, oh my God, do I have to answer that question again?
Yeah.
You know, and there isn't a really good answer. There's just that long-winded, not very satisfactory one.
I think that's that's an excellent answer. B, the actual answer is sort of ephemeral or like endlessly political, but I figured if we were ever going to talk about it, it's worth talking about now. Meg, did you want to say something? I was going to go, but did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is that, and because of that connectedness that we feel to each other, Newfoundlanders on this island, we also want to do right by one another. We also want to reflect our culture in a way that makes people feel proud or feel present or feel seen. And so there's something very powerful in a group of writers who are writing for like reasons more than just commercial or fame or technical, writers who have a sense of like belonging to a group, that they want to feel some sense of joy in the story that you're telling. Like when I'm writing something, I'm always very aware that I am part of a collective that is putting out work that is meant to be reflective or representing our home, right? And our relationship to our home, both good and bad. And so it allows us to be together on the page in a weird way. And I think that's really interesting. We also, aside from all of the humor and the competitiveness and all of these innate qualities that we share, we've had to be very self-reliant on the East Coast. And so that level of self-reliance, that level of resourcefulness allows you to take on unconventional employment. And so like when you're checking off that EI form, it's like self-employed. And that's not something that's so unknown to us. Like most of the people that I grew up around were their own boss. They set their own hours and they knew what they put into their outfit was what they were going to get out of their outfit. And so that's where my work ethic comes from. So I apply a fisherman's work ethic to writing, which I suppose has suited me just fine, so to speak. Like I'm doing moderately well. I'm on this panel with you guys. I feel like that's a success. And I don't know that people who grew up in more comfortable conditions would be able to embrace the hardship and the kind of humiliation that sometimes comes with putting your voice out there, like making yourself vulnerable to criticism and rejection in that way. But on the East Coast, that's bread and butter. And so no one's like particularly afraid of it. Or even if there is fear, you work through the fear and you hope that what you make is artful and contributes to the canon in some way.
I think we lost Amanda there, so I'm sure she's on the way back. I'm sure it was just a technical.
My answer was like just devastating.
she was like, I'm out of here. Andre, as now the sole Nova Scotian representation on the panel, but there's a lot. Hi, Amanda. I'm so glad you're back. We missed you there for a couple of seconds. Oh, wait, hold on. I got you muted there. Hold on.
Sorry about that.
Oh, not a problem at all. Nice to have you. So Andre, now you're not the sole representation of the Scotian panel. I mean, however, there's a lot to unpack here. You know, you're hearing Newfoundlanders talk about their communities. You're hearing, Michael talk a little bit about how, Newfoundlanders historically had a hard time being published. I mean, I've read interviews with you where you were very candid about, not seeing people like you on screen growing up, not seeing people like you in literature growing up, not having access to the stories that told your community. So like, it's a very nuanced conversation about like, East Coastness that we're having here today, and it's one that's I would say has developed over the decades as we start to acknowledge who have we included in the East Coast in the past and who have we included from the East Coast in the past. So I mean, Andre, I just want to broadly open it up. Like, how is this stuff reflecting with you, and what's your feeling on sort of the East Coastiness of your work?
Yeah, there's such a rich history here, but I feel like Nova Scotia is a mystery to a lot of folks outside of it. I know I write mostly young adult fiction these days. I'm still in that storm of teenage angst a little bit with my work, and I feel like some of the stories that I write are universal for so many people, but I feel like being able to base my stories in the East Coast, in Halifax, and the South Shore also kind of gives me an opportunity to send a love letter to these communities that I have roots in, and in these communities that I grew up around. My first novel, Worthy of Love, was a novel that took place in Halifax, which was about a young man struggling with an eating disorder, and that may seem like a taboo topic, but it did bring a lot of attention. But it also did open up Halifax to a lot of folks that were far away. And with my second book, Annika, which was a fantasy novel, a coming of age fantasy novel told through the lens of a young African Nova Scotian woman, was also an opportunity for me to write love letters to these communities that I also still have roots in myself. When I think of the South Shore, I think a lot about my great grandparents that are from there, some great aunts and uncles, and they're also kind of communities that some folks sometimes forget about. But for me, it's an opportunity to kind of like bring them in the forefront and just tell these stories and have people soak it in and know there's stuff going on in this little province on the East Coast here.
Does it make you feel? Do you feel a similar kinship to the other authors in the province?
Yeah, I feel like kind of like there's definitely on the mystery front, like people just kind of want to know more. When people kind of think the East Coast ends at a certain part of Canada, there's still a few more provinces to go, and I think there's just like that curiosity just kind of brings more eyes on our stories.
Amanda, I'd love to bring you in here. How is this reflecting? How is this impacting you? Like, what are your reflections hearing what you're hearing so far? And I'm sure you've also been asked about that sort of East Coastiness of your work. What are you thinking here?
I definitely like feel what Meg was saying about, you want to make people proud in the place that you're from, and the stories that you tell. I think there's such like a warmth with people in the East Coast, and that you get these stories that are very real and other people can identify with very much. And for me, doing stories from my community, that's something that like I really wanted the elders in my community to feel seen and heard. Their stories are something that nobody's talking about, nobody had an interest in or anything. But yet Africville is something that's talked about all across Canada, down through the States, everywhere. But yet we don't realize that those people are still here, and we can talk to them and we can hear their stories. And so it was such a great experience to see them come to life and feel so seen and heard in that experience. And it definitely connected to like so many people across Canada.
Do you feel a kinship in sort of the in I guess the East Coastiness of the work?
Definitely, for sure. Yeah, there's a lot of people on the East Coast that write and that have like offered support or guidance, things like that. So it's definitely a kinship here.
What's been the most like memorable part of that for you? Like what's been maybe the most memorable thing someone said to you about these stories that you've been telling? That I mean, what I'm really struck by in the stories is that like, you're I mean, it goes without saying that you're absolutely right. Like there are so many stories told about Africville and the history of Africville in people outside of Canada know about the history of Africville, but how much do people actually know about the true lives of the people who live there? What's been a piece of like feedback or something that you've got that's been particularly meaningful to you after going through that?
So there's a story that one of the elders, her name is Beatrice Wilkins, and she talks about the experience of, there's racism, obviously, and ambulances wouldn't come into Africville to help people. So she actually watched her mother deliver her own baby and then get dressed and walk across train tracks to try and flag down a police car to take her to the hospital afterwards. And she tells this story in such a way that she's so proud. It's not something that's like, oh, this terrible circumstance that happened and it's so sad that my mother had to do this. She tells it like she's so proud because she, as a young woman, was watching this happen and thinking of the strength and determination and just the skill that's involved there, and the tradition of being birth workers as well. So it just was like a really powerful story.
I mean, tremendous resilience and just a tremendous story. I mean, all going around through this whole thing. Mark, I think of everybody I've ever met in my entire life, no one has been asked the like, why are Newfoundlanders so funny questions? Because I even know that like I'm from Newfoundland, and when you come on the show, people would say to me, we should ask them a little bit of question about why are Newfoundlanders so funny. So I'm not going to ask you why are Newfoundlanders so funny, but I want to get your similar sort of reflections on this.
Well, I'll start my PowerPoint now if I could take control of the screen. I think because we were this remote place and the way that we were settled, people did entertain themselves, and I find that still at a lot of house parties and stuff. People come, if you don't play an instrument, you can't sing, and you can't cook. Well, Jesus, you better be interesting or funny or have a way with words. Recitations, histories, that oral, which I'm always afraid to get caught in when someone says, "I'll give you a recitation." I minds the time in '62. It's like, okay, nobody's getting their boots on. But we have this oral tradition that's so rich, and I think that we've always entertained ourselves. And a lot of, I find, Newfoundland literature or jokes or stories, it's always a darkness kind of alluded to but not talked about and dealt with, and the weight of that carried with a dark humor. And I think there's a way of talking about things, but talking around them, that actually makes for a really interesting way in which to talk about things. And I think that's always a part of what we do here. I find it as interesting when I was starting to go on the mainland. When I was doing what you do now, you would have Newfie joke books in places, right? And so a lot of that first generation who went off to Canada when it joined us in '49, and in the '60s working in the your hot dog factories and whatnot, there was this big the dysphoria had really held tight to those things, the Harry Hibbs music, and there was like a ghost of Newfoundland culture, a way that people really clung to. It was very important to them because it was their way of saying, no, it's not Newfie joke books, we got our own thing. And I remember once being on a flight coming back, and a bunch of guys from Alberta got on, and all of a sudden everybody was in camouflage, and we're talking and stuff on the boat and on the plane. And this guy sat next to me. He's like, "Oh, I know you. You're that Newfie comedian." And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm a Newfoundland comedian." He goes, "Oh, I'm from Newfie. Okay, great. I got everything Newfie. I got all the Newfie music. I got all the Newfie TV shows. I get all the Newfie purity stuff. I got a Newfie clock of Newfie with all the letters on it. So, I'm a Newfie. Everyone at work says, 'Here comes the Newfie.'" And I say, "You flying home?" He goes, "No, I'm going to the Dominican Republic. There's nothing for me back there now." And I said, "When was the last time you were there?" And he goes, 78. And this was like, 2001. And so there's that kind of a thing too, where I think there's the authentic Newfoundland voice and Labrador voice, and with these stories and that continuation of our own thing. But there's also this other odd offshoot, which is like an echo of that, like a mourning of that from people in generations who cling to and support a lot of entertainers and writers and whatnot, but are somewhat removed from it as well. So it's interesting the way that culture kind of fractured.
This has been spectacular. We're going to go to some of the Q&As from the audience right now. I'll remind anybody, there's still a little bit of time to put some new ones in. We get some great questions here, but if you have some questions for the authors, either directly, individually, or we can put them out to everybody, put them in the Q&A, and we should be able to get through, I think, maybe one or two. I'm interested in this one here from Floyd. I feel like I'm hosting open line here. Like, this is great. I feel like this is great. Floyd Spracklin, which is a solid homesick name for me. He has a great question here. He says, "My question is about epiphany moments, and it's directed to any or all who'd like to answer. Under what odd circumstances does that special aha moment come for any aspect of your work? Plot, character, etc. I'm signed in from Nain, Labrador. It's near 50 below out here. Floyd Spracklin." Floyd, thanks for getting on the line from Nain. Sounds like it's freezing out, so I'm glad you're able to stay warm. And Andre, only because you were nodding and smiling when I said the epiphany moments that will come to your work. And given that, especially in your YA work, there would have to be such plot development, there would have to be so much character development. Can you speak to any of the circumstances to which there would be sort of an aha moment, or the moment where the novel kind of comes together?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of feel like at this point in my career, I'm understanding that writing is mostly just problem solving. Like, you have so many characters in the scene, you have a theme you have to get across, and how are we going to do it? And the thing that I find helps the most when I'm feeling stuck is literally just taking a nap and coming back with a fresh mind to the scenario. It really does work. But I also feel that writing scenes and kind of doing this work does actually make you better at solving puzzles and other games and stuff too, which is really funny, I find. But yes, those moments happen often, and I had one of those moments this week. I was stressing myself out writing down a chapter, and yeah, sometimes you just gotta leave and come back with a fresh mind a couple days later, maybe, or even just like a couple hours later. But yeah, those moments come often, and it really is a reminder of how much I have fun doing this.
Michael, can you speak to that? Like, someone with a lot of characters in their work, like, when do those moments offer themselves to you?
Yeah, I think that for a lot of those things, you just have to let them bake, and especially really complicated scenarios. If you sit down and try to ram it through, 9 times out of 10, it's just not going to work. I used to run a lot, and I found a lot of those things that worked out on runs because I wasn't actively thinking about it, and my body was involved in doing something else. I've given up running now, so I'm probably finished as a writer. But it was a nice. I had a good run.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Amanda, can you relate to any of this in terms of poetry? Poetry is, to me, I mean, as I don't have any experience with it, to me it seems so generative. It would seem that, like, you would sit down, and my idea is like Ginsberg sitting down and tapping away at a typewriter, everything that comes out of him. Can you relate to this idea of having a moment where either a poem or a story or a narrative kind of comes together, and the circumstances that might allow that to happen?
For me, it's really usually emotional things. So something like hits me hard and I kind of like want to process that. And in processing it, I will write it out and that kind of develops it right there.
Like you'll have an emotional experience, or you'll learn something, or something will happen, and that will be the thing to kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, even just like stuff that I'm trying to deal with and like just process my own emotions and stuff. I write a lot. I write a lot of emotional poetry.
Are you ever stuck? Like, are you ever stuck and you don't know how to finish it? And like, are there things you would do to be able to kind of get through that?
Um, I'm kind of like Andre, that you just kind of have to walk away from it
Yeah.
and, you know, let that resolve itself. And it just kind of comes when you're not thinking about it. Yeah.
Mark, I'm interested about this in terms of, I mean, sketch writing. I mean, the thing
Well,
about
comedy in general, it's like
Yeah.
everyone's been saying, I think anything great is a subconscious mind either working on it in the background while you finally let it go. Because when you're doing this, it's never, it will be workmanlike. If you're any good, you can do something, I think, that is funny, you know, or humorous. If you're in comedy, you can at any time, any given scenario, I can give you something that will be okay, because that is what you do with your tools. But anything, an audience can tell if something is happening authentically in the moment. That's why, like, if you throw in a line, or they can sense if something is happening, and that will be the biggest laugh you can get.
I'm not
And
sure I
that's-
understand. So the audience can understand if
Like,
the thing
okay,
is
you're doing your whole stand-up act, right? And you've been working, people do stand-up acts since 20 minutes, they've been doing it for a year. But if they do a little crowd work and something happens in the moment that somebody says that they've never said before, in that moment, that will be the biggest laugh of the night. Bloopers, things like that. And it's a different thing. And laughing, a comedy, I think, is the only art form you cannot fake to yourself, right? Like, you can go, you could be playing in an orchestra and you can walk away and everybody's going to clap and you go, oh, we did great tonight. You can put a painting up in a show and people sit around with their white wine and go, I like the gentle nuances of texture and shading. And you'll be like, they love it. But comedy is the only art form where if they don't laugh, which is akin to sneezing, vomiting, or peeing your pants, it is an uncontrolled response, right? So it's like, bleh, that's why people look so ugly when they laugh, because they're not in control. If they don't do that, you did fail. If you're on stage as a comedian, right? And you can say like, oh, tough room. It's like, no. You didn't get them to do it, right? So so they do it right in front of you. So you had to be very honest with yourself. But anything good I've ever written, like anything that's really done well, I couldn't get it down fast enough. Like, it's coming from another place. And I was like, Jesus, hang on. And it will come. And then you work on it and shape it. But the general thing comes through you from another spot. And I think that's all the stuff, because it's reactionary, right? So you'll see something on the news and you go, oh, Jesus. And then you'll know what it is and you'll get it down. And the authenticity of that is always funnier than Justin Trudeau. He has nice hair. What can we, like, that will never be as good as, oh my God, I know how to make fun of you. And, or say something funny. They can smell the truth.
Megan, I'm dying to know what you have to say here. I mean, I'm trying to figure out what words I want to use to describe your writing, but I think that the thing I'll land on is that oftentimes when I read your work, I find myself reading about the main character and like, they've got themselves in a snarl and I wonder how they're going to make it out. And I'm wondering how that might relate to the author's own relationship with the work. So can you relate to any of the stuff we're talking about here?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think some of my best moments as a writer has come when I've given up trying to dominate the story, when I've totally given up control of the character's decision-making power.
What does that mean, that to give up trying to dominate the story?
Like, sometimes you can have a prescriptive intention as a writer, whereby, especially when you're trying to think about something from a social justice context or a political context, which is how I engage with a lot of work. I see something in my community that makes me feel really uncomfortable, like something that's been, I think, unkind to people. I guess perhaps being from a rural remote place, being marginalized, like having faced a lot of discrimination for my accent as a younger person, made me very aware that you can be treated differently based on what is happening and who's in the room. And so I sometimes move into a narrative with like a goal. And it's not necessarily a definite or a directive kind of, it's not an authoritarian kind of intention. It's more like, I want to talk about this. I don't necessarily know what I want to say, and maybe I don't have a resolution for the context of the story, but I want us all to talk about this difficult thing. And so a lot of my writing is me trying to approach the difficult thing in a way that doesn't harm or alienate. I mean, some of my writing is very like full on, like it holds people accountable for their actions in a way that might make people not just offended, but potentially really upset. And when I'm like not trying to hold them accountable, it seems to be the times that I figure out how to do it in a way that is most effective. And that happens for some reason, like Michael said, when I'm outside. And perhaps that's because I, as a child, would tell myself stories when I walked around the cove. Like that was a part of my like play. I would have an imaginary like narrative kind of world where when I walked around the cove by myself, I would just make up these characters, not like imaginary friends. I knew I was writing the story as I was walking around. It really upset my grandmother. In fact, she found it a little bit unnerving that Maggie was going around, talking to herself. But you know, all my family just accepts that I'm a little bit different, and they love me regardless, I hope. And so when I'm outside, especially if I'm in nature, like if I'm in the woods, like if I'm out in the woods stomping around with the dogs, that's when paper is furthest away from me. That's when I'm like, oh, this is what should happen there, and this is how this person would feel, and that would start that chain of events that would then get me to the conversations that I have been trying to start for however many pages.
It's beautiful. We're going to go to the final question, which is what everybody's reading at the moment. But actually, Andre, there's a question for you specifically that I wanted to make sure, and it's striking me because they picked up on something that I think I missed out on when it came to the way you were talking about your first spoken word work, and I guess the work you've ever done since. And I just really love this question, and I'm hoping before we get to the reading question, you might be able to answer it. It just says, "Hi, Andre. How do you do things when you feel nervous?"
I think the best thing is try not to stress yourself out too much. I used to put too much pressure on myself before performing. And at one time, I've been to nationals with spoken word 7 times. And there was one time I was at nationals and I dropped my entire poem. And it was embarrassing, but I think that was the best thing that's ever happened to me, because it taught me a lot about myself and my own kind of process. And you got to stop putting so much pressure on you to like remember certain parts. I think about it as if I'm doing a spoken word piece, as you're telling a story, you know. Things happen, be fluid, be in the moment. You know, if you forget a line or two, no one's really going to notice, and just be gentle with yourself. And if the worst happens, then the worst happens, you know, it's only uphill from there. And I think a way to fight nervousness is to just be kind to yourself. I mean, there's so much pressure on everybody, but you also have to remember that you need you too. And that's kind of how I get over that sometimes.
It's beautiful. I'm going to stay on you for the book recommendation. So what are you reading at the moment?
Thanks a Lot, Universe by Chad Lucas.
Well, tell me a little bit about that book.
So Chad is a middle grade author, and Thanks a Lot, Universe is a really great YA book about two young boys who find each other at an interesting time in their lives. And he announced a sequel coming out, I believe, early next year. I could be wrong, but check out his Instagram page or his Twitter account. All the information is on there. Chad's a really vivid writer, and I love his work so much. He has another book, I believe it's called Let the Monsters Out. And yeah, can't recommend them enough. If you have any young people in your life that you want to gift some coming of age books to, he's the guy.
I was told at the end of this, where all these book recommendations are going to live somewhere, I believe, on the Giller social media. So keep an eye out for that. Megan Gail Coles, you're up next. What are you reading, and tell me about it?
I am reading a lot of like neuroscience books right now for my PhD that I'm working on. And the book that I'm actually rereading, because when I read it the first time before Christmas, I didn't take any notes. I just burned through it. So now I have to go back through the entire book and read it again, is the new Gabor Mate book, The Myth of Normal. And it might sound like what I'm suggesting is really dry and academic, but it's not. It's actually very accessible. And it doesn't matter what your relationship is to like childhood development or trauma or Western medicine. I actually think it's a book that would be valuable to anybody of any background, and just like kind of understanding how interconnected everything is and how the relationality really impacts our lives, like our, not just our physical and mental health, but like the systems that we have currently in place that aren't healthy. Like it's very, I think, an illuminating book. And he wrote it with his son, which I also think is rather impressive. I don't think me and Nels are ever going to get together and write a book. But so that in and of itself is kind of a triumph.
I love the idea that you're writing books, you're writing short stories, you're going out into the woods with the dog, and you're pursuing a PhD at the same time, man. Isn't that
I got 2 dogs. We can't leave Gertie out. There's 2 dogs, and they come along for everything. They're really good sports about it, even when I'm being totally boring and chained to my computer for like the whole day.
Wow, I'm glad we found an hour of your day, to be honest. Like there's a lot going on. Michael Crummey, how about you? What are you reading right now? He got it on him. He got it on him.
Is this backwards? It's backwards.
No, it's not backwards for
Michael.
us. And Michael, this is the sweetest book recommendation.
Yeah.
So this is a Message in a Bottle by my wife, Holly Hogan, who has, she's a wildlife biologist, spent most of her adult life near or on the sea. And Amanda talked about some of her writing being a love letter to the community she comes from. And this is in a way, Holly's love letter to the ocean. And also a story about her growing awareness of and kind of horror at the impact that marine plastics are having on life in the ocean and also on our own physical bodies. It's coming out with Knopf in June, but it's available for pre-order now. It's actually a beautiful book. So she also knit this sweater, and she's a better writer than she is a knitter. Can't recommend it highly enough.
Beautiful. Mark, how about you?
I just read out Plains, David Sedaris's Happy Go Lucky. He's a very funny writer from the States. Little short essays about his life, and I've been a huge fan of his. But I've just started Jenny's Boy by Wayne Johnston, whom I'm a huge fan of, a Newfoundland Labrador writer, about a young Wayne growing up, a sickly boy in Newfoundland with a ferocious mother and an eccentric grandparent. So I'm realizing this is a very me book. It's very much in my wheelhouse. So I'm a huge fan of Wayne's and everything he does, and I'm just enjoying it. But I'm also writing the new season now, so I'm not really getting much of a chance. I'm trying to enjoy it when I can.
I'm glad you're getting a bit of escapism though in your life by reading about
I know.
your,
I'm like,
your
I
exact
picked the
life
book.
and comedy writing. I'm glad you're getting some escapism in your life, Mark. It's great. Amanda, last word to you. What are you reading, and tell us a little bit about it.
So I'm usually reading doula books because I'm actually a doula as well. So a lot of my reading right now is about birth experiences. But I have Al Jones's Abolitionist Intimacies right here that I'm waiting to like dive into as soon as I get through a couple things. So, and that's just about the justice system in Canada. Al Jones is brilliant and just gives us so much information that I don't think many of us think about very often. So I'll definitely encourage everyone to pick that one up.
But I can't begin to tell you how much, I mean, by the way, second L. Jones reference of the night, by the way, which is always a sign of a good panel. What a joy it was for me to be a part of this tonight. Thanks to each of the writers for making the time. This has been really fun for me. Again, it's made me tremendously homesick, but I think it's like an incredibly fulsome discussion about being an East Coast writer, you know, how that's not just one thing, and there's a lot of different lanes about being a writer from that side of the country, from our side of the country, I suppose. And before we all go, I just want to thank each of the writers, and I want to bring Alana back on to say some closing remarks. And on my behalf, this has been a great joy for me. So I think I'm finally going to get to go home from work now very, very shortly, which I'm also really looking forward to. Alana, last word to you.
Okay, so I ugly laughed and ugly cried throughout this whole hour. So I thank you for that, Mark Critch. I will never be able to get the image of two banging moose out of my head, which I thank you for. I thank you all for this incredible hour, for your wisdom and insights and your recommendations. I know that we had no drop off in our registration, in our attendance tonight, so that's saying something. I want to just also mention to anybody who's missed out, and you can pass the word along to anybody who's missed out on tonight's event. They can catch it on our YouTube and website in the coming days. And also to check back at Scotiabank Giller Prize for upcoming new and exciting power panels and book clubs in the months to come. So thank you all again. I really appreciated your time and talent.
I was actually watching the attendees go up, which was always a good sign. I was like, we're getting more in, like everything's working out, you know?
You did a great job, Tom. Thank you.
Once you play in bars in St. John's, you have a way of watching how many people are in the bar at any moment and whether people are coming in or leaving, but that never goes away. I've learned that. Have a great night, everybody. If you're, I want to say safe home, but you're probably already home. So safe home to me.
Thank you again so much.
Take care of yourselves. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.